Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the first of our series of In Conversations With, where we'll be having a little conversation going deeper into aspects of effective collective worship in our church schools. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Elisabeth Sutcliffe. Elisabeth, hello.
Hello, nice to be here.
It's so lovely to have you with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I think you wanted me to give a little introduction. So I'm Elisabeth. I'm a children's worker at the moment at a church in Bedford, but I'm a trained primary school teacher, and I used to teach in a church school and then also a non-church school for about 7 years, mainly in upper key stage 2. And I was also the RE and collective worship lead. So that's a little bit about me.
Oh, super. Well, I know, Elisabeth, you come here with a wealth of experience, and I know you have a real passion for collective worship, but also spirituality and spiritual development. So I wonder what led to your interest in those areas?
So I've grown up with a Christian faith, and I think I've always had kind of an interest in kind of children's faith and spirituality, and also in education. And so when I did my PGCE and we had to research pupils' perspectives, I found myself really interested in, well, what do children actually think of assemblies of collective worship? Because I was teaching year 6 at that point, and they seemed to kind of trudge off. I just thought it'd be really interesting to see what they actually thought. And that sparked kind of an interest in me in thinking, how can we really make collective worship meaningful? And so then I thought, well, when I'm doing a master's, that's what I'll focus on. That'll be really interesting. And then I was told I couldn't just see what pupils thought, I had to research my own practice. So I thought, well, I am meant to do class assemblies once a week, and usually I just avoid them because I'm not quite sure what to do, and I generally don't have enough time, and I haven't thought about what I'm going to do, but it seems like I'd better do that. And so that kind of led me down the path to really thinking hard about how can I do collective worship. And at that point, I was in a church school, but I was teaching a class where there were 4 children of different faiths who were usually withdrawn from collective worship. So it was, how can I do something in my class that will be meaningful for all of the pupils, despite the different faith backgrounds that they come from.
Oh, it sounds amazing. And it's really interesting for me because it's something which you kind of identified in your own school context and kind of pursued a little bit differently, and just sort of trying to think, well, how can we make a real impact here? How can we engage with all of those people, as you said, to make collective worship really meaningful?
Yeah, and it was hard, actually. I didn't really want to do it, and my supervisor kind of kept pushing me to go a bit further. But as I gradually tackled more and more things, over what on earth spirituality is and things like that, then became it became a really kind of fulfilling bit of research and work that could then be taken a bit further.
So that notion of spirituality, I think, is really, really interesting, because in my own practice and my own reading, I quite often notice that it's quite central in, curriculum aims, and it's central in lots of different documents. But it's a term, and I wonder if you've noticed this as well, that it's really elusive and it's really difficult to define. So I wonder, from your own experience and your own thinking, what do the words kind of spirituality and spiritual development mean to you?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, that no one quite wants to define spirituality because it's something that by its very nature kind of is hard to put into words. So I think with spirituality for me, I did quite a bit of reading, and the things that stand out are kind of children have a heightened awareness. People sometimes talk about moments of awe and wonder. And Hay and I talked about a kind of relational consciousness where they're trying to work out their place in the world, and they relate it to themselves, to others, to the world, and to God, or for some people that might be like an ultimate order of things. But when I was looking, it seemed that a lot of people were saying that it is this kind of universal feature of particularly childhood all our lives, and are asked to develop it. But when I was kind of trying to work it out, I thought it kind of splits into two parts. You've got spiritual experience, where children will have those moments where something really stands out, or they'll have a sudden thought that comes to them, or they'll see something and it will speak to them in a different way. And then there's kind of a time where they have spiritual reflection, where they kind of are thinking about their own beliefs, and they might ponder those moments that they've had and what do they mean to them. And that was a time when in my research it came out that they'd think about kind of something in relation to their past, or they'd think about, well, what do they want to do in the future? And so that was how I ended up kind of thinking about spirituality, and it gave me a bit more direction for how to promote children's spiritual development, because you have to provide opportunities for those wow moments and thinking about something in a new way, and also give them the chance to reflect on the experiences that they've had, and think about their place in the world and what it means to them.
Oh, thank you ever so much. Certainly I found Rebecca Nye's work and that relational consciousness, which I kind of think of as the up, down, left, right spirituality, really useful. And I've been interested to see staff teams arrive, it's always a journey, but arrive at a shared understanding of what spirituality and spiritual development means in their context. And the more they've been able to engage with those questions, it's been really fascinating seeing how they then identified moments of their curriculum which they feel can really cater and capture those real spiritual moments, those spiritual questions, those times to reflect, but likewise in collective worship. And they can create collective worship opportunities that are a little bit more intentional, and it really helps them in their practice. So that leads on to the next question then. With schools increasingly at the current time exploring class-based worship, how can it be a really purposeful and amazing place for spiritual development?
So from my experience, class collective worship, because it takes place in a smaller group and in the classroom that pupils know, it's already a safe space. And if you compare that to in normal times where you kind of have to march off into the hall and then sit as a whole school where you've got different ages, you've got kind of siblings across the hall, people that you don't know very well, it can be quite hard to have that really deep personal reflection. And what we've just said about spirituality is that it is actually quite a personal thing, that reflection, working out your own place in the world. And so doing it in the smaller setting of the classroom where you know all the people who are around you, I think can lead to a deeper reflection, and sharing those reflections more comfortably with others. It also gives the opportunity to be a bit more creative, and I use godly play for some inspiration, and the word play is quite important, kind of exploring different ideas and thinking about what it means to them. And you can do that in some different ways. I never had time to do more than kind of get them to draw a picture or something, but sometimes we've just said spirituality is really hard to put into words. Spiritual experiences and reflections are really hard for children to put into words, and doing that in the classroom means you've got the potential to give them another means of expressing themselves. The challenge, of course, is they're in the classroom the whole day learning, they're with you as their teacher the whole day, and then it's a slight shift in roles for the space and for you, and then for them as well. And so kind of being able to mark the time and say, this is different, this isn't learning, this is kind of reflecting and exploring together. I think you need to be really careful that it does become a different time, because otherwise you might be sending out messages you don't realise about what this time's actually for.
I totally agree. I think class-based worship offers an opportunity for approaches that can be, really creative and at times quite innovative. So, I've seen some really great examples of class teachers using, Play-Doh and Lego and art and, a myriad of other things, which in many cases aren't quite possible when you collect and gather as a whole school for worship. So I'm really interested in what you mentioned about how to separate a real sense of space and place in collective worship. One that doesn't just seem to be, okay, we've been looking at within our curriculum lessons and then we're going to, something which is similar. What advice do you have to class teachers in trying to really demarcate that special place for collective worship within the class?
So I think there has to be something different that you do. So the way I did it was I always lit a candle and I said a few words which were about what the candle might mean to them, which varied depending on their different personal beliefs. And then put the candle out at the end. So I was marking the whole time. And I found it was amazing that actually at the moment I struck the match, they just kind of stopped and it just stilled in the classroom and they were ready for something different. But you might not be allowed to do that. You might want to do different things, perhaps playing some music, perhaps just slightly rearranging something in the classroom or putting up an image, something that you do regularly so it becomes a pattern and something that they expect, kind of helps mark the change. Even just a little bit of stillness before moving on might do that. And then I think you have to hold that whole time and space. You have to hold this space where you're not looking for particular answers. You're not trying to come to a solution. You're holding the various different reflections and ideas that they might have and encouraging them to carry on considering what they think. And generally just kind of a slightly calmer, more peaceful atmosphere, using a slightly softer tone of voice, not always being in a rush and hurrying onto the next thing, as generally happens in the school day because you've got to cram so much in. I think just that slight sense of stillness through the time can also really signal to the children that it's okay to stop and just to be.
It's that sense of quality over quantity which comes to mind when it comes to that. Thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's a time where many class teachers who may be a little bit unsure and uncertain in leading class-based worship, which seems to be a feature of the current circumstances of the bubble worship. What advice would you give them as they start on this journey themselves and they start to think about and indeed start to lead class-based worship themselves? Are there any top tips that you have for them?
So I think the first thing is kind of don't panic. You're suddenly having to do this thing. You might have had a small amount of training on it if you were lucky. I maybe got about 15 to 20 minutes as part of my whole PGCE. And then it was also something I avoided for quite a long time. I was meant to do it and it just kind of got shoved out because of time. Or I remember one time I put up a picture of penguins and was just like, oh great, they're huddling together. We should be a team too. And I just thought, where's the depth to that? And so it's something that I've really wrestled with for quite a long time, and it's not kind of an easy thing to do. And so with that, there are no right answers, and you have to be true to yourself as you're leading it as well. But I think for me, it was when I realised that it was about creating the space for children to have their own personal response, then it became a lot easier to move on from that. And then the other thing I found was the power of the story, because when you got a story that maybe they hadn't heard before, or that was told in a different way, there were just moments where you could think, they've clicked on something. I can see they're thinking about something in a different way, but it's not me that's done that. It's just I've found the right story. And I think it also gives them the chance to do that playing, that creative thought, that working about their own experiences, but through the safety of discussing it as the story rather than their own experience. I had some children that did talk about themselves and some children that just talked about the characters in the story. And yet they were all talking actually about their own experience in different ways. And then another thing is godly play, which is like a Christian way of telling these stories I've mentioned. they use things which are called I wonder questions, and I found them very freeing, because we talk about how open questions are really good to use with children and with everybody, but as soon as you use the words I wonder, it immediately signals to children there really isn't a right answer, and all we're doing is wondering, and you might wonder one thing and this person might wonder something else, and that's okay, and we're leaving it as wondering. We're not trying to force ourselves to come to an answer, which is a really powerful thing, I think, to signal to children. So I found that that's a really easy change to how you ask a question that changes the feel in collective worship. Yeah, I think, don't worry, as I said, about getting it right. Actually, it's about keeping wondering, keeping mystery, rather than trying to achieve anything in particular. It's not like you've got objectives for collective worship, and actually that makes it quite an enjoyable thing to do.
Thank you, Elisabeth. I know, collective worship is always something which is invitational and it's inspirational. And so having things like stories where pupils can engage with, biblical texts or different stories in their own way, I think is absolutely amazing. And I totally agree with you. I think it's important, as we do in all areas of the curriculum, to be really reflective and to take steps to try new things, then reflect. And it's a journey for us as we learn more about collective worship and how to facilitate it, and not to think, I have to be perfect in leading this from the off. It's certainly a journey, as you found through your experience and your research, and I certainly found that when I was a classroom teacher as well. So thank you ever so much. So in terms of signposting, then, I'm aware that we only have, a little bit of time to have this chat, although I'd love for it to go on for much longer. But for those wanting to explore class-based worship, or maybe collective worship more generally in developing their practice, where would you recommend people look? Resources, websites, books, and things like that?
So in terms of books, I was surprised by what books I found when I actually looked in the school. And if you're suddenly stuck, then just see if there's a book and opening it. You might find some good stories or ideas in there. The other place I often go for ideas is SPCK Assemblies, which is just a website, and you can just put in any search term and then it will find any assembly that has a link with that. And again, I don't usually use all of it, but there's just something there that I can pick out as a bit of inspiration. If you're interested in the sort of thing that I've done, if anyone thinks, oh, it'd be really interesting to have some stories and I wonder questions and see what happens, I actually went on to do a secondment where I was creating some of these worships for my school on behalf of the Church Schools of Cambridge. So they've got a website, and there's lots of free resources there of some of the class collective worships that I wrote and did with my class, and other teachers did them in my school as well. So you might be interested in trying some of those, and then seeing what works for you. So there are just some first ideas. And when I was researching and reading kind of Godly Play UK and Rebecca Nye, and actually someone called Tony Oud, there are some really nice kind of ideas about children's spirituality, and Tony Oud was particularly about how you could actually do collective worship in a school with some ideas. So that might be a good place to look as well.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you ever so much, Elisabeth. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you this morning. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and signposting colleagues to other resources and ideas out there that I'm sure will really help them thinking further about collective worship.
That's fine. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.